Millions of people flood the streets in the city of Manila, Philippines. They are celebrating their victory against a corrupt regime that has ruled in power for 14 years. Ferdinand Marcos was ousted from office through the power of the people. This act of revolution would inspire other nations such as Taiwan and Indonesia to fight back against similar corrupt regimes. The world watched as Cory Aquino, whose husband was shot dead by the Marcos regime, led the front lines of the people's revolution.
Marcos was the 10th president of the Republic of the Philippines, and under his tenure, people start to realize that there were massive corruption ongoing, and not only that, he also abused public office. One other thing that makes people in the Philippines anxious was that Marcos continues wanting to extend his time in office. He did that through amending the constitution. He made himself president for almost 20 years, or beyond, slightly beyond 20 years.
Ferdinand Marcos was one of the world's most corrupt leaders in the 20th century. Marcos holds the record for the greatest robbery of a government by the Guinness Book of Records, as he was recorded to have stolen around 5 until 10 billion US dollar from the Philippine government during his rule. Forbes magazine put him second only to Suharto in his corrupt acts. During his time in power, Marcos murdered many people, from activists, university students, laborers, journalists, writers, communists, to Muslims in Mindanao. His body count reached over 3,000 people, not to mention the people that he had ordered to be tortured. His killings were ordered in the name of national security. Benigno Aquino was one of the victims of the Marcos-era murders. He was killed on 21st of August 1983. His death sparked many demonstrations in the region calling for Marcos' resignation.
The repression against the opposition was getting more intense, and this triggers waves of protest as well from the people. And so at that time, one of the first leader of the opposition who was jailed was Benigno Aquino. And he was so confident and determined to run against Marcos that when he was in jail, he actually built a political party, the Liberal Party. So his determination led the Marcos, of course, become very determined to eliminate him as well. So when he was sick and he was sent to the United States for treatment, and then upon his return to the Philippines, he was assassinated.
A political crisis wasn't the only thing that led to Marcos' fall from power. In his book, Crisis in the Philippines, Bernard Villelegas wrote in 1982, the Philippines had suffered an immense economic crisis. This was caused by several factors such as the increase in oil import prices, loss of revenue from agricultural export, and the rise of foreign debt interest rates. Between that resistance, the figure of Cory Aquino appears, a woman, a housewife whose husband was shot dead by the authoritarian regime of Marcos.
Number one is, of course, people look for alternative power who can voice their concerns. As I mentioned, economically, Philippines was lagging behind a lot. Philippines was known as the sick man of Southeast Asia at that time. Numerous monies come pouring down to the Philippines, but no projects actually touch the Filipinos.
By that brave and selfless act, but for Ninoy, a long and
Behind Ferdinand Marcos' fall from power is a woman named Maria Corazon Sumulong Cojuangco. Cory Aquino, as she is sometimes called, is the wife of Benigno Aquino, an anti-Marcos revolutionary who was jailed for 7 years, exiled to the United States from 1980 until 1983, and then was killed under orders from the regime.
Philippines for decades, even until now, is still known for a country that's marked with cronyism and political dynasty. And so, in my view, it's very difficult to eliminate, frauds in election, and it will become even worse if civil liberty is suppressed. So this was what happened under Marcos. But to my view, this is not the only reason why people want him to be toppled. So there was no other alternative. Benigno Aquino was then former senator who was jailed, was among the strongest opposition to Marcos. And when he was assassinated, it becomes very clear that Marcos is determined to continue being in office, no matter what, at whatever risk. And at that time, it was already clear internationally that Philippines lagged behind economically compared to other neighbors, let alone to other developing countries. Marcos' mode of ruling was he borrowed lots of money from various sources, including from the United States, World Bank, and different kinds of international financial institutions. But that doesn't go to development projects. And Benigno was himself a former journalist, a person who has track records on civil liberty. So juxtaposing him and Marcos becomes very clear that something very much injustice has been ongoing in the Philippines. So when he was killed, there was a defect from the inside of Marcos' government. Two of his generals was defecting from office. One of them was Fidel Marcos.
After her husband's death, Cory was involved in a number of political demonstrations. She had become a symbol that united the disparate pro-democratic opposition parties. Her political career rocketed overnight. A petition made for her to run for the presidency collected over 1.2 million signatures on December 1st, 1985. Cory officially ran for the presidency on December 3rd, 1985. She ran with the full support of the United Nationalist Democratic Organization, UNIDO, which was the Philippines' biggest opposition party at the time.
So at that time, the church as well also started to speak up against killings and injustices. Thousands of Philippines was killed and arbitrarily jailed for speaking up. So the situation was very, very tense, as you can imagine. So Cory Aquino was never in politics. But she was highly educated. If you notice her biography, she can speak French, she can speak Japanese, she can speak fluent English as well as French. And she has a bachelor degree in French and in mathematics. She is also known for her ability to speak up against injustice, because when his husband was jailed, she was the one campaigning for him, and she attracted attention. But interestingly, she herself was not very much interested to become leaders of political parties. So that's what distinguished Aquino from everybody else. She is not hunger. She doesn't have hunger for power.
During her campaign, Cory was not only supported by opposition parties, she also had the support of upper middle class Filipinos, alongside the personal support of the Philippines Catholic Church leadership, Cardinal Sin. Support from both these parties remained strong throughout the campaign. Catholic volunteers had used the church radio to broadcast pro-Cory propaganda, breaking Marcos' control and monopoly over broadcasted information. On Election Day, 7 of February 1986, 400,000 pro-Cory volunteers came to safeguard the election process, calling themselves NAMFREL, National Movement for Free Elections. Their main duty was to guard Cory's campaign from any possible tampering from the Marcos administration. To ensure Cory's loss, Marcos had false ballots made and also ordered the killing of Evelio Javier, Cory's campaign manager. Cory was announced to have lost the election on the 15th of February 1986, despite recording the most votes in the election. Cory's loss due to election tampering had instead led to a rise of a bigger wave of protests. These protests include a boycott of products or services that had any connection to Marcos or his colleagues.
Number one is, of course, people look for alternative power who can voice their concerns. As I mentioned, economically, Philippines was lagging behind a lot. Philippines was known as the sick man of Southeast Asia at that time. Numerous monies come pouring down to the Philippines, but no projects actually touch the Filipinos. And Philippines was also known as the country with the highest inequality in the region. So, of course, Marcos was not the only leader and the only potential future leader of the Philippines. I think that motivates them. So Cory Aquino come also from the family that's very influential, the Cojuangco family, and also from her parents, her grandparents was congressmen, so they know how politics run. And not only that, there are also other factions inside of the military that also desire something else. So if you notice, under Cory Aquino leadership, there was 6 attempts of coup d'etat, and this was arranged as well by these factions of military who still unhappy, but the one who sustained Cory Aquino's presidency was Fidel Ramos. He was truly believed as the military man who helped stabilize her presidency.
On February 22, 1986, a coup d'etat broke out, led by the Minister of Defense, Juan Ponce Enrile, and General Fidel Ramos. Both of them believed that Cory was the true victor in the elections. This coup had led to a bigger wave of revolutionary acts all across the Philippines, named the People Power Revolution. This act of civil disobedience, coupled with the military defecting from the government side, led to Cory's inauguration as the Philippine president on the 25th of February 1986. On the same day, Marcos fled to Hawaii, marking the end of his regime and the start of Cory Aquino's administration.
And here we see Mrs. Aquino. She's accompanied by the majority leader.
Corazon Aquino was inaugurated on the 25th of February 1986. Her presidency had to meet the expectation of one of the most successful acts of civil disobedience in the 20th century. Her administration had to meet various challenges and threats during her time in power. However, Cory still maintained a high degree of support from the Filipinos, proving that her programs were working well for the people. What happened during the election is proof of the Filipino people's loyalty to democratic principles. Government reform became Cory's main agenda during her administration. Cory disbanded organizations that supported Marcos' regime along with retiring generals that were past their retirement ages.
Okay, the first thing that we have to realize is Cory Aquino entered a politics that used to be very patriarchy. So speaking up for women, for civil society activists was a taboo. She lifted up that barriers. First, by releasing 500 political prisoners. So that alone symbolically restore civil liberty. She also revoked all the barriers imposed to journalism. So there was freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of gatherings under Corazon Aquino. And then the other thing she introduced was a new relationship between the central government and the local government units. We can call that devolution of power. So local government units are given the authority to collect tax, but at the same time they would still enjoy getting subsidy from the central governments on certain terms and references. So she also attempts to do reform, agrarian reform, which is very critical for the Philippines. As I said again earlier, Philippines is a dynastic family. So unless you do something to eliminate that ownership of land, that they can empower people, then democracy may not be able to sustain. So she took critical steps that actually help seal democracy in the Philippines.
She also completed a core campaign promise to free political activists from imprisonment. One of her major accomplishments is constitutional reform, ensuring the creation of a government that is effective in handling problems. On the 23rd of April 1986, Corazon Aquino signed the Constitutional Commission Law of 1986, Announcement Number 9, which created a body tax with drafting a new constitution. It is hoped that this constitution will truly reflect the desires and ideals of the Filipino people.
There was no alternative to power at that time who become not only alternative to Marcos' power but also symbol of repression. And her husband, who was assassinated, was a symbol of that, incorporates both of that. So that was the biggest reason why people gather and mobilize around her. And don't forget, as I mentioned, she got the support from not only the Catholic Church but also from the reformist armed forces, including from the generals. So people feel safe going out and mobilize, going into gatherings in big streets of EDSA. So some of it is philosophical, some of it is practical, some other is also technical. So there won't be any gatherings so massive like that unless you feel safe to go out. And Cory was able to provide that. That was a good timing for Cory Aquino.